Welcome to G-Man Gaming and Reviews. I thought today we would do a part 2 to our beginner's guide to the Vampire Coast faction. So some things that I really didn't cover in the previous guide. So we're going to talk about hero units, lords, and the spells, which I didn't cover in my previous guide, so we'll do it now. So the first thing that we're going to do is talk about our lords. I recruited a Vampire Fleet Admiral. Now, the reason I recruited this Vampire Fleet Admiral is I needed a second army to take out the dwarfs in support, so that's what I did. So this Vampire Fleet Admiral has the Law of the Deep. The Law of the Deep is actually unique to the Vampire Coast. It's a very interesting law. So the first option, the first one that it comes with is Spiteful Shot. Now, this one is actually really cool. It only affects one unit, but the big advantage of it is it gives one unit plus 90 accuracy and magical attacks, which means you can put this on an artillery piece, and it's got a duration of 72 seconds, and it's just gonna make your artillery piece really good, especially if you need to deal magical damage to take out ethereal units. Really useful. The next passive ability is Kiss of the Deep, which deals small amount of damage per second while it's casting to all enemies. Next you have Tidal Call, which is a breath spell. So just for beginners, a breath spell is, I'll show it in the unit and spell browser so that you can understand what it is. As you can see, there's a lot of laws. Where's Law of Depth? Here it is, Law of the Deep. Okay. So you got Spiteful Shot that increases the accuracy of one unit. Very good to pop on your artillery. You've got Tidal Call, which is a breath spell. The way that breath spells work is it creates a little sort of tear-shaped area on the map, and then when you use it, it will start from the point of the triangle and then expand outward. So it's a basic attack spell, not much to say about it. It does damage. It's really good for attacking through enemies on the side like that. It's really good once the enemy front line is engaged with your front line to do some extra damage in the back. The next one is Fog of the Damned. This one is actually really good. What it does is that it does leadership -8 and melee attack to an area when it's upgraded. So it just makes it, this probably would have been more useful in a melee faction, but if you've got a whole bunch of missile units, if you've got a whole bunch of missile monsters, this can actually be really good to basically drop it on where there's a whole bunch of enemies and just have them drop in leadership and melee attack. The next one is Denizens of the Deep, which is a summon spell that summons 2 Rotting Prometheans. Really good to summon behind an enemy unit to have them charge in the rear while they're engaged in the front lines with your unit. The next one is Kraken's Pull. This is a vortex, so what happens is you just drop it. Generally you want to drop it when enemies are stationary, so it's really good to use if you're attacking a settlement and the enemy's just waiting there. It's also useful to use when the enemy has engaged with your front line in order to get some damage on them. And then you've got Vargeist's Revenge, which is a wind spell. Now, the way with wind spells is what you want to do is, as you can see here, it goes through multiple enemy units, so in a line. So it's actually really good for targeting an enemy if they're just sitting there and waiting. It's very useful in that respect. The next one that they have access to,
the Queen of Tides,
is the Law of Death. Now, the Law of Death it's more useful for the vampire counts, but it's still very useful. It has these 2 spells called Aspect of the Dread Knight and Doom and Darkness. Doom and Darkness is basically you drop it when you're in melee and it drops their leadership by 16%. Aspect of the Dread Knight gives 1 unit magical attacks leadership and has the unit cause terror. Spirit Leech is really good for dealing damage to strong versus characters. Soul Blight is another one that you drop on a whole bunch of enemies, so you can drop it at the same time as Doom and Darkness to really... So it's a hex, so you want to drop it like when the enemy is clumped in an area, that's where you want to drop these two spells. Purple Son of Zerusis is a vortex spell, which means you pop it down and it moves randomly, but it does a lot of damage. Useful for dropping on an enemy unit when they're static. Be careful about using this spell when you have a whole bunch of enemy units engaged with yours, because it could move on to your units and kill your units. And then you've got the Fate of Buna, which is a direct damage spell, which does damage to one unit. So like I said, with the Law of Death, I tend to use these two spells together, but it's, in my opinion, like, for the Vampire Coast, it's the Spirit Leech spell, this spell, and the Fate of Buna that are much more useful. This spell's also that are much more useful because you got a ranged army mainly. The other one is the Law of Vampires. Now keep in mind, this basically... Oh, that's interesting. I didn't realize that it worked on all units. So the Law of Vampires is somewhat similar to the Law of Death, but it has some spells, like for Invocation of Nehek is a healing spell, but it only affects undead. So if you're playing as, like I am, Aranessa, it won't heal your Sartosan units and your ogres, right? So it's not as useful in that respect if you're playing as Sartosa, but if you're later on, you're not going to be using undead units anyway unless you decide to use man ogres. Man ogres with pistols are interesting. I don't know if they're viable, but they are interesting. So let's go back to the spell browser. So Van Hel Dance Macabre increases the melee attack of a unit, which is really useful. It's more useful this one is more useful if you're playing as the vampire counts. Generally, unless you've got a lot of melee units, you probably don't want to be using this. Invocation of Nehek is a healing spell, so if you've got a lot of undead units, which you probably will, really good for replenishing them. Raise Dead summons a unit of zombies. When it's upgraded, it summons a unit of skeleton warriors. This is really good for creating speed bumps in front of knights. It's also useful for summoning them behind the unit and charging them from the rear. Gaze of Nagash is a magic missile spell that's strong versus a single combatant. It does require line of sight though, so you have to be careful when you're using it. It's really good to be using it on things that are flying, which is with the vampire counts you don't really have. So unlike with the Vampire Coast, you don't really have, because you don't really have any flying lords. I think they can only be on Rotting Promethean. That is a problem in using this spell, but it's very strong versus large combatants, and it's very strong versus single combatants, so you can get some utilization on this. Curse of Years is an awesome hex spell that silences enemy units so they can't use abilities and drops their melee attack by 24. Very useful. And Wind of Death is a wind spell that goes in a line through enemies, so it's really good. Like I said, this is a little bit of a weaker sort of pick with the Vampire Coast, simply put because Invocation of Nehek is good, but Curse of the Years is good, but you have to get towards the end of the tech tree for the spells before you unlock it. So really, it's okay. But for the Vampire Coast, I think the Law of Death and I think the Law of the Deep is actually much better. But it does have its utilities. So now we're going to talk about heroes and non-legendary lords. So with our heroes, you've got the Gunnery Wight. The Gunnery Wight is quite crucial to the Vampire Coast. It has some really powerful abilities like Enhanced Ballistics, which increases accuracy and reload speed. It actually has some bombs that it can drop. Quite a few uses, actually. So it's not only good, and it also has its own melee attack. So it's actually really good. It's useful for buffing your army. It's also useful for attacking enemies. I normally like to pop one near my artillery and then one near my deck gunners. But that's something of use. The next one that you have is the Morngul Haunter. This one is more useful on the map because it has assassination, right? So this one is really useful for assassinating enemies. It does also have stalk, which means it can be used to assassinate enemy characters, but the problem with it is the characters that you probably want to be using it against, like mages and stuff like that, later on they're probably going to be flying. So you're probably not going to be able to get to them with this thing. So most of the time, you're probably just going to want to be using it on the map to assassinate. It does cause terror, but in your army, you have a lot of other things that cause terror, so that's useful. And then you've got the vampire fleet captains. They have very low armor. I know it says decent melee combatant, but they're actually not. You really don't want these guys in combat. You really don't want them in combat. I think once they get upgraded, they get rotting Promethean mounts, but really you don't want these guys in combat at all. So one of the things and then for the lords, apart from the legendary lords, you've only got vampire fleet admirals in male and female. When you're picking a vampire fleet admiral, they're always a spellcaster. The trait that they have is important because it's how they gain loyalty. So if you're going to pick a plunderer, you need to have this guy raiding and sacking, right? If you're going to have a smuggler, you're going to want him constructing pirate coves, right? If you have a murderer, you're going to want him going after enemy armies, right? Firestarter likes to raise settlements and win siege battles, and an instigator is an interesting one. They gain loyalty from recruiting and fighting with other pirate lords. Instigator is probably the easiest one to use because you can have it shadowing your main army and it will gain loyalty, which makes it really good in that respect. You have to pay attention to which trait they have because you really want to make sure that they stay high in loyalty, because if they drop in loyalty too low, if they drop to 0 loyalty, they'll form a new faction, but if they get loyalty lower than of 4, I think you can't disband them because there's a chance that they'll go rogue. So I don't really tend to use these very often. The one that I tend to use the most is the Instigator. Simply put, because it's going to be shadowing my lord and recruiting, which is useful. But later on, the Smuggler, like if you send one of these out to like the enemy, to like far away from the enemy and just have them creating pirate codes, could be useful. But really, the main lords that you're going to want to be unlocking are the ones in the tech tree, which are these ones. Simply put, because they don't have the loyalty mechanic, so once you recruit them, they'll stay with you. And they also have they also are a ship build. They also have the shipbuilding mechanic, like your legendary lords do. Yep, so this was my continuation part 2 of my guide to the Vampire Coast. Please can subscribe if you haven't already done so. I loved your comments on the previous one. I was most appreciated. Thank you for all the feedback. I really did appreciate it. This one should sound better when I release it. It shouldn't have all my arms in there. But yeah, so this was G-Man Gaming and Reviews. Please subscribe if you haven't already done so. Would love to hear your comments. Signing off.